I hope you're having a great day. So today we're reading, we're still in chapter 15. Yeah, I have to get it on this video that only does 15 minutes. Blech. But remember, yesterday we read about Moshe and David, and they're flying down this cavern. Oh, that's what I called it. I think that's wrong. Okay, as the boys swept down from the gorge, David dropped the plane several hundred feet in elevation. Just below them laid the barbed wire encircled blockhouse of a British police station and the red tiled roof of the Trappist monastery of the 7 agonies of Leitrim. How many agonies will our people face, Moshe wondered, before prejudice and suffering come to an end? Every foot of this territory had once belonged to the ancient nation of Israel. Just beyond them, in the valley of Ayalon, where the sun stood still for Joshua. Remember that, Mom, in the Bible? I remember, stood still for more than a day for Joshua with his hand up. Then the road twisted through the valley of Sychor, where Delilah was born, and Samson destroyed the crops of the Philistines by turning loose foxes with burning tails. I know you know that one, Mom. The ruins of Gezer laid beneath the bald hill just beyond, the dowry of the daughter of Pharaoh when she married Solomon. He loved this land and hoped in the promises. We are the people of the book, Moshe said at last. Millions have been murdered beneath the apathetic gaze of men looking out for only themselves, saving what's left, making sure nothing ever happens again. That is my concern. Yeah, said David quietly. I wish you luck. And as long as I'm here, I'll do what I can. But I've got a future. And I just spent 4 years fighting a bloody war, and I'll tell you, pal, David paused and frowned, leaning forward to stare intently at a small black form that crept slowly forward like an ancient beetle along the road. What is it? Moshe asked. The bus from Tel Aviv? Yeah, but look back about half a mile. There in all those rocks and beside the road? Moshe strained his eyes to see what David's sharp eyes had picked up moments before. Far below them, like a swarm of crawling insects, there were at least 100 scarf-clad warriors waiting for the bus from Tel Aviv. Just beyond them, hidden from view in the bend of the road, stood a roadblock of stones and timbers. Behind the bus and out of sight behind a small hill, the armored vehicle waited to cut off their escape. As they watched from their high vantage point, the bus passed an Arab sentry on an outcropping, who then signaled the armored car to pull forward and block the road. Hold on, David cried as he pushed the throttle forward. We're going down there for a better look. Moshe braced his feet against the floor and gasped as the ground and the Arab band loomed before them until he could clearly see the pattern of the checkered scarves and the startled expression of terror as the men ran for cover. Pull up, Moshe shouted, certain that they were going to plow nose first into the earth. Pull up, he shouted again, as the stubble of an Arab's beard became clear and the shrieks of the men were louder than the roar of the engine. David's hands remained firmly forward, with the ground looming only feet from their faces, and then with a suddenness that hurled Moshe backwards, he pulled up, thumping the head of a scrambled banshee with the landing gear. Oh my gosh, Mom, he hit one of the robbers with the landing gear. Ah! Yeah, David shouted as Moshe scrambled to regain his seat. Did you see that? He climbed steeply, then he banked the fragile little cub for a better look at the chaos below. That's the way, darling, he cried, patting his instrument panel. For a moment, Moshe was reminded of Ehud stroking Ave Maria, the boat. And he wondered at the madness of the men in this war. He looked down at the Arabs who were pointing their rifles at the little blue Piper Cub. Small explosions burst from their barrel, and they showed that Geez, let me find my spots. That they were indeed firing at the plane as they struggled to pick themselves up from the dust. Spotting the Piper Cub's hawk-like swoop, the bus had halted momentarily. Then, seeing the armored car move in behind it, it lurched forward towards the band and the roadblock. They can't see the barricade, Moshe cried. David circled the plane, barely noticing each time the dull thud of a bullet that tore through the fuselage. We got to go again, he said, and he pushed the throttle forward, plunging into a dive steeper than the last. Breaking up that little tea party, he thought through gritted teeth as he struggled to control the tiny plane. Again, the ground and the enemy rose up to meet them as they plummeted toward the rocks. The rattle of a machine gun burst was heard from the armored vehicle, spraying the air around them and shattering the windshield. Dust filled the cockpit as David pulled up at the last possible second, leaving the ground littered with screaming, cursing jihads searching for their guns. The bus inched towards the barricade as it rounded the corner. The dull thump of two landmines blew up its tires. David climbed out of range of the shower of bullets and quickly surveyed the damage. The wind was streaming into the cockpit. He had a gash over his eye, and below them the bus crept to a lopsided halt, and the Arabs rushed forward with their rifles raised in rage. To David, it looked like a scene from a Western movie when the hostile Indians circled the wagon train. Use the wireless. Call Tel Aviv for help. Are you kidding? David said. This thing barely has wings, let alone a radio. We'll have to try and make it to Lydia and hope they can hold out as long enough for someone to get there. Dive again. We'll chase them away. The plane won't take it. We'll end up in pieces. David struggled with the rudder and set a course for Lydia, the airfield, as Moshe slumped in the seat beside him. Once he looked back and glimpsed the tight pillar of black smoke that rose from the horizon, and then they flew the last 15 miles in silence. Moshe, certain that he could have run the distance faster than a crippled little aircraft. He felt sick with the certainty that any help that could reach the bus was already too late. That afternoon, the tired waiting room at Lydia Airfield was crowded with British officers and Jewish civilians waiting for word on the fate of the Jerusalem bus. David sipped coffee as Moshe paced and listened to the cackle of the wireless on board the British armored car. When at last the news came, the bearded man beside David crumpled in silent sobs. No survivors. 32 dead, as near as we can make out. Gosh, Mom. Okay, so we're going to start on 16, which is Kibbutz. Rachel, remember Rachel, Mom? The lady that Moshe rescued from the boat. Rachel stared at the slats of the bunk up above her. Outside, a child threw a ball against the wall of the barracks with a steady thump, thump, thump. She stopped counting after 111. A small group of women, Dachau survivors, Dachau, that's, Hitler, one of his work camps. Dachau survivors sat at the far end of the room near the stove, lowered their voices as they cast furtive looks in her direction. Words like traitor and whore drifted down to her, and she wondered why they bothered to lower their voices at all. She knew she was the topic of their conversation. They had survived their ordeals and kept their lives without defying the law that called for death before loss of chastity. Rachel had saved her own life, but had sacrificed her soul in the bargain. She sighed and glanced around the bleak interior of the makeshift kibbutz housing. It was clean, certainly, a far cry from the displaced persons camp or the filthy concentration camps. But Rachel wondered if she would ever sleep again in a real bed or set her own table for supper. Would she ever comb her hair in front of a mirror that did not reflect the image of a dozen other women jostling in line? Nieta kibbutz was clean. The food was good, but it was not home. For Rachel, it could never be home, not as long as others spoke in hushed tones about the brand she wore on her arm. They called her a whore and turned their backs on her. Even those Sabras, the native Palestinian Jews, who smiled or spoke kindly to her, did it only out of pity, never seeing the person who lived beneath the indelible mark of the SS. She got up and walked slowly, her eyes downcast, past the group of whispering women. "Oh, look," one said, just loud enough for her to hear. "The whore is finally out of bed." The group snickered and passed the comment from one to another. Numb, Rachel glanced up and smiled sadly at a thin, frail young woman bouncing a baby on her lap. A sneer crossed the woman's face, and she called out to Rachel, "Business is bad since you came to Palestine, eh?" The group roared with laughter as Rachel turned her head away and hurried outside. But their mockery followed her into the sunlight. Small children ran through the neat rows of Quonset hut barracks, enjoying a sad game of tag. One small boy fell headlong into her legs as he dodged his pursuer. He hit his chin on the ground with a thud and wailed loudly for his mom. Rachel knelt down to help him. "Are you hurt?" she asked, brushing the dirt from his trousers. "Mama!" he cried. "I want my mama!" "There, there." She touched his curly hair and looked at his chin. "Only a scratch, just a little scratch. You'll be all right." She smiled. From behind her she heard a high-pitched shriek from the door of her barracks. "Samuel!" Rachel turned to see the thin woman hand her baby to another woman and run towards her and the little boy. The boy saw his mother and wailed even more loudly. "Mama, she knocked me down," he wailed. "This lady tripped me and knocked me down." As a small group of angry women gathered about her, Rachel began defensively. "The boy fell into me. He was playing." "Get away from my son!" shrieked the mother. "Get your filthy hands, Nazi hands, off my son!" Rachel tried to speak, but the woman charged her, knocking her to the ground, and then she spit on her. Grabbing the still whimpering boy by the shoulders, she scurried back to the building. Rachel wiped the spittle from her cheek and blinked hard to hold back her tears. A dozen other curious camp members looked on silently as she rose from the dirt. And then, one by one, they turned their backs on her and walked away with their arms about their children's shoulders. They must not speak to her or even let her shadow fall upon them. Only one, a thin, timid girl of 18 or 19, dared to break the silence. Brushing the strands of dark hair out of her face, she stared up at Rachel with wide eyes and whispered, "In the camp, we all did what we must to survive." Her glance traveled unbidden to the tattoo on Rachel's arm. "But never that. Never that." "This place is still a death camp," Rachel thought, "and I am one of the living dead, selling her body to the enemy in exchange for life." She had died to her people and lost her soul. She had only one hope left, that her grandfather was still alive and in Jerusalem, where she had last heard of him. She was not like the rest of these survivors, she told herself as she raised her chin and returned to her bunk and the tablet of writing papers beneath her pillow. She had family in Jerusalem. She had the family, and the Jewish agency would help her find her grandfather, a yeshiva school teacher in the old city. She would go home. Gosh, Mom, that's so sad. All that she endured, and then those people, they're so mean. People are so mean. We have to be kind. I love you, Mom. Okay. I'll talk to you later.